Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a beer, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. So 3.17 brought us 14 new unique items, 3 or 4 from each of the 4 new bosses, and I wanted to put them in some sort of a tier list where we're going to categorize them according to whether they're uber items, solid items, forgettable items, or underrated items. So of these items, only the chase ones, which are Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh, are expensive. All of the others have a high enough drop rate that by late into a trade league, they're all pretty cheap. Some of them were pretty expensive early on, like Polaric Devastation was 6 or 7 exalts early league, and Crystallised Omniscience would have been expensive early on, it's just people hadn't caught on as to how good it was then. We're going to start with the S tier uniques. These are the ones that are universally considered to be amazing, and there are actually 5 of them. This is something that doesn't happen very often, that you get this many powerful uniques. Firstly, we have Ashes of the Stars. This is the single most used non-dual unique on characters that are level 95 and up. This amulet is just really simple and powerful. So firstly, it grants raw power to any build. +1 to the level of all gems is a damage multiplier to a lot of builds, and 16, even 20% reservation efficiency is fantastic on basically every build. At the moment, auras are so much of a part of characters' defense and offense that getting an additional 1 in is a huge damage multiplier to your build. That increased reservation efficiency, even if it's not enough to get a whole extra aura in, it may be enough to then fit in and power attached to one of your most important auras. But the second purpose of Ashes of the Stars is the ability to augment strong alternate qualities on certain gems. So there are a number of gems that have really strong alternate qualities. And whilst Ashes of the Stars only applies to skill gems and therefore not to support gems, it is still a very powerful effect to be able to say, hey, my Phantasmal Earthquake is going to have an additional up to 30 quality on it. That's an amazing effect. There's a number of skill gems that gain a tremendous benefit from having those sorts of buffs. So that's why this is the most used unique item that is not a dual in the game at the moment amongst very high level characters. And it's also quite a budget item as well. Second is Melding of the Flesh. Now this item does only bad things when used by itself, but in conjunction with a few other effects, it can provide a tremendous defensive layer for your character. In conjunction with the huge resistances that are given either by Mage Blood at the high price point or with Crystallised Omniscience at the low price point, which we'll get to very soon, a Purity of Ice aura, 100% aura effect, and another source of 5% maximum cold resistance will cause Melding of the Flesh to make all of your resistances 90%, your elemental resistances. There are other configurations. You can use this in conjunction with other items as well. But broadly speaking, this item will give you a tremendous boost to your effective hit points against cold, fire, and lightning damage. It does ask a lot of you. You need to make a lot of extra resistances up in order to take advantage of this item, because it is going to provide at least a 70% reduction to each of your resistances. Lastly, there is a slightly less obvious use for Melding of the Flesh, and that is in conjunction with the unique chess piece, Doriani's Prototype. Doriani's Prototype causes your lightning resistance not to apply to you, but instead overwrite the lightning resistance value of all nearby enemies. So with Doriani's Prototype, this is a very easy source of negative 70% to all elemental resistances, which, whilst you have to make up that with 70% increased fire resist and 70% increased cold resist, it will give all monsters near you 70% decreased lightning resistance, which is a big deal. Next, we have Crystallised Omniscience. This item is arguably the most powerful of the batch. When you start playing around with this, you realize that this amulet, essentially, for a moderate level of investment, is going to give you more than 100 points of elemental penetration on all of your skills, and more than 100 to all elemental resistances. And you know that last item that we were talking about, Melding of the Flesh, that was the one that was saying, I'm going to crank all your resistances on you? Well, Crystallised Omniscience is going to provide all those resistances back and more. So with Crystallised Omniscience, you are going to receive a tremendous amount of elemental penetration. For comparison, I think it's worth thinking of the unique item Ulnatal's Vow. This is also an amulet, so it competes for the same slot. It also provides some resistances, and if you socket it with Awakened Cold Penetration at gem level 6, then Ulnatal's Vow is going to give about 40 to each resistance and about 40 points of elemental penetration. Crystallised Omniscience can give 3 times those figures, and Ulnatal's Vow was a chase item last league. Next, we have Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh. These are a pair. You need to have both jewels and they need to match. That makes this essentially almost Trade League only. There'll be the odd person that gets this, that gets a combination of the two of them together in the solo self-found environment, but that's going to be very rare. Now, these are the most used 3.17 uniques amongst level 99 plus characters, despite being very rare and being effectively Trade League only. Even if you can't afford to shell out 50 exalts for the Profane Vloom version of this, which is arguably the strongest of them, you should check out the budget choices. A pair that grant Patient Reaper to an Assassin, for example, is just a couple of dozen chaos, and it will grant you tremendous life recovery while mapping on any Assassin build. Also remember that you can check for a 5th notable in your existing Ascendancy, as this is often a great choice. So for instance, a trap-based Saboteur probably has 5 nodes in the Saboteur Ascendancy that they would like to take, and 2 they're completely uninterested in because those 2 relate to mines. So they can pick 4 of them naturally by the time that they're quad ascended, but then they can actually use a Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh to pick up the last one, if that's worth it in comparison to the alternative of using 2 classic jewels instead. So do keep that in mind. There are a lot of options with Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh, and they are very, 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 very strong. Next, we're going to talk the A tier uniques. So S tier are the ones that you should probably fit into your build any way you can. A tier uniques are very, very, very strong, but not necessarily as universal. And a lot of the time you will choose to use a very good rare over one of these, or you will choose not to use one of these at all because you've got a different plan for your build. So firstly, we have the Annihilating Light. This is the highest caster damage weapon that has ever existed in the game, but it does have a couple of problems with it. If damage doesn't solve your problem, you aren't dealing enough of it. The Annihilating Light will deal explosive damage at the expense of fundamentally ruining your resistances. This is not the same minus 60 to 70% elemental resistances modifier that you would have seen on Melding of the Flesh. So this just says minus 80 to minus 70% to all elemental resistances. The Annihilating Light is fundamentally different. It says 60 to 70% reduced elemental resistances. What this is a 60% less multiplier to the magnitude of all effects that modify your resistances. So this means that if you have gloves that have plus 45% to cold resistance as an explicit mod on them, and you have an Annihilating Light that is 60%, then instead of getting 45%, you're only going to get 18% cold resistance from those gloves. So this is a huge drawback, and the item is worth it though, but generally speaking, you can only use this in conjunction with Crystallised Omniscience or Mage Blood. You need to get an absolutely staggering amount of resistances from somewhere on your character in order to make up for this tremendous penalty that is present on this item. That said, the damage is often worth it. Polaric Devastation is the next item, and this is a really solid pure damage item for characters that deal fire or cold damage as their primary damage. So applying a 20% more multiplier to damage dealt for a ring slot is generally a really good deal. Now, this benefit of either Covered in Ash or Covered in Frost is applied in the same layer as Shock. So what this means is that if you shock for 25% and also cover in Frost, the enemy will take 25% more non-cold damage and 45% more cold damage. This item fell in popularity as more people acquired the Interrogation unique cluster jewel or other sources of Secrets of Suffering. And that's because the two effects don't work together, as you need to freeze or ignite, and most players chose to prioritize inflicting brittle on enemies rather than inflicting Covered in Frost. However, Polaric Devastation is still really good as long as you are not using the Interrogation. Next, we have the meme tier uniques. This is the dumpster, broadly speaking. These are not the items that I think have some hidden potential. These are the ones that I think are just generally not very good. This doesn't mean that you're objectively wrong if you use them. It means that they are just... they're not likely to be the right choice on most builds. Inextricable Fate is the first one I want to call out here. These are the unique fugitive boots. So against bosses, the benefit of allowing your elemental damage to poison and setting poison chance to 100% is big. However, the 1.5 second delay is manageable, but Grasping Vines will get you killed. Against trash, Grasping Vines will infuriate you, and the 1.5 second delay ensures this item does nothing. So nearby enemies gain a Grasping Vine every 0.5 seconds, and until they have 3 on them, then this item is basically doing nothing. Also, I gotta say rare boots are really good right now. You're not competing with just 30% move speed 100 life and 35% chaos resistance on boots these days. You are now competing with things that are far better than that. On a low budget, you can get 35% move speed and 5% move speed from bottom tier Exarch mods in conjunction with some other reasonable mods on the item. And that's on a really low budget. On a higher budget, you can get far, far, far better, either with influence boots that could have existed in past leagues, like your good old Tailwind boots, or you could get something that uses the new influence modifiers instead. So yeah, there's just so much better than Inextricable Fate that's available, and I just really don't think this item does very much. Getting killed by Grasping Vines is infuriating, and it's going to happen a lot if you try to use this on bosses, but this item just does nothing if you're against a non-boss. Sudden Dawn comes next. This has an interesting mechanic with terrible stats. I was asking myself as a bit of a thought experiment, would I use this over an influenced rare if the item had a 500 energy shield? And I think the answer is no. I still wouldn't use it. And this item has half that amount of energy shield. In practice, it typically has about 250, and I think it's a pretty comprehensive no to whether you would ever consider using this. That said, if it did have a doubling of its energy shield, maybe you'd give it a go. If this 300 to 350% was increased to 700 to 800%, maybe you'd try it in future. Another thing that's really difficult with a helmet that's off meta and bad is it's very hard to find it with a useful enchant on it for your build, and that makes this even worse. Gluttonous Tide is next. Gluttonous Tide is a Citadel bow. This is an interesting mechanic but has terrible stats. There's a real problem that GGG haven't been able to work out how to solve with unique attack weapons. They're a nightmare to design because they have a single most important stat, and that is just the raw damage that they do, whether that be physical damage, whether that be elemental damage, or whatever. If you scale that mod too high, you wind up with a return to the 3.7 era with Starforge, where your two-handed melee weapon progression quite literally went like this. You start with a leveling rare. You upgrade from your leveling rare to a 5-link Starforge. You upgrade your 5-link Starforge to a 6-link Starforge. You upgrade your 6-link Starforge to a 6-link Starforge with a good corrupt. And then, maybe, you upgrade from that to a merit tier rare. There were a few other options around with Elder Influence weapons as well at that point, but broadly speaking, Starforge was just so dominant that it made most rare item crafting just a non-event. That's why they ended up nerfing Starforge as hard as they did. On the flip side, that's what happens if you scale an item too high. You get 3.7 Starforge. If you scale it too low, you get Gluttonous Tide. Ultimately, I don't see any justification for using this item really, and it seems like most high-level players agree, because you basically don't see anyone using it. Black Zenith is next in the meme tier. I have been trying these gloves, and they're sort of fun, but they are just not very good. They were absolutely broken on launch when the cooldown didn't work in some circumstances, and that circumstance was in conjunction with a channeling skill linked to Spell Totem, which was Winter Orb in practice, but could also apply to Stormburst. This has been patched, and the cooldown now works in that situation. 4 seconds is just too long in a game as fast as modern-day Path of Exile. This would have been a really cool item in the 2013 era of the game, but 4 seconds is simply too high. I would be interested to see how good these gloves felt if they were given a 2.5 second cooldown instead of 4 seconds. I think at that point they might start seeing a little bit of use. This would be a secondary skill that you would see as being almost like using a Val skill. The timer goes off and then you're like, all right, now I've charged up my big power attack, I'm going to use it. And ultimately, you probably feel like you get to use it almost as often as you get to use a Val skill. Next, we're going to jump on to the underrated uniques. Underrated doesn't necessarily mean that they're good or bad, just that these are items that are widely perceived to be worse than they actually are. Dissolution of the Flesh comes up first. So this is a prismatic jewel. It removes all energy shield, and it gives you a big chunk of extra life, but causes life that you lose to taking damage to instead be drained from your maximum life as a reservation instead. This continues until you take no damage to life for 2 full seconds. This is a creepy name, it's an awesome mechanic, and it changes life recovery to work more like energy shield, but the numbers are just a little bit too low to justify using it in most play. 2 seconds is just a bit too long in the current state of the game. The concept though is incredible, and if this were changed to be 1.2 to 2 seconds, so that Divine Orb would change that within that range, then I think this would be used. Likewise if the life was a little bit higher. That said, this item is solid now with Petrified Blood. It will grant you tremendous resilience against one-shots, but what really kills you in the modern day Path of Exile is not often being one-shot. It is generally being one-volleyed, so you have a whole bunch of enemies hitting you in a very short period of time. And Dissolution of the Flesh doesn't really do all that much in a situation like that. And that's because you would get some life recovery in between those hits, especially if you're using a build like a claw attack build that can regenerate life extremely fast. But even on a traditional build, you will still have several hundred points of life recovered usually during that volley that's bursting you down. Dissolution of the Flesh turns all of that off. So let's say that you're surrounded by enemies. You take 105% of your maximum life, and so in that sense, Dissolution of the Flesh has kept you alive. You now have 25% of your maximum life unreserved, that's your base maximum life, and you're in real trouble. Additionally, the fact that it removes all your energy shield really does hurt with using it to mitigate one-shots, because one of the best ways to mitigate one-shots is the Vaal Keystone Corrupting Soul, which grants you 15% of your life as additional energy shield, is a better way of mitigating one-shots than Dissolution of the Flesh is. So cool mechanic, but I just think the numbers are a little bit too low for the moment. That said, do give it a shot. There are builds that can use this, and Captain Lance put out a good video of how he's been using it to great effect on a character. Dawnbreaker comes up next. Now this is widely considered to be dumpster tier, and I think this is not dumpster tier, but it's not good either. The shield does something powerful if you get the right Vaal implicit on it. So it has 20% physical damage conversion to fire. That's damage you suffer converted to fire. And an additional 6 to 8% physical to fire as a potential Vaal implicit. So this means that you could get, say, 27% of incoming physical damage converted to fire. If you can get similar mods on other gear slots and also be a chieftain, you can stack a lot of this effect. And as a result, you can wind up in a situation where 90% fire resistance can also provide you tremendous physical mitigation, but also significant mitigation, at least, to other elements as well. This item is not for every build, but it's not dumpster tier either, and it's common enough in Trade League that you can Corruption Hunt it. It is the most common drop from the Searing Exarch. Ceaseless Feast comes up next, and I made a separate video on this, but basically, once you've hit an enemy 3 or 4 times, and well, not 3 or 4 times, you have to have 3 or 4 corrosion procs on the enemy will have no armor left. At that point, every time that you hit an enemy, you've got a good chance of getting yourself an endurance charge, and you'll pretty quickly be in a point where that enemy is stuck at 0 armor, and you are gaining your endurance charges quicker than you can lose them. The same thing will happen with frenzy charges. It'll take a bit longer because stripping away evasion rating takes longer than stripping away their armor. However, what this is going to give you is the equivalent of a few thousand accuracy, basically all the accuracy that you need, except for the first couple of seconds of a fight. It's also going to give you all the physical overwhelm that your build might need, which may well be none, may well be a bit. And otherwise, the charge replenish against bosses is like Replica Farrell's Fur. It's not as good as Replica Farrell's Fur, but it is also in a less competitive slot. This is something you might consider using on Cyclone builds because other melee builds would need plus strike targets, which is only available on gloves and is just far better than anything Ceaseless Feast does. However, you can also use this on builds that aren't melee. You can use this on a bow attack character, you can use this on a wand attack character. In both cases, this will keep you at maximum endurance charges and maximum frenzy charges, as long as you are at least occasionally fighting super tanky enemies, ones that you aren't instantly killing. I really like this item. I think it's super, super underrated. Anyway, that's all I've got. That's my tier list of the items that are in the current league. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results, and I will see you around.